As threatened in my final lecture for this unit, we move north into a more Protestant world. In 1648, the 80-year war between Catholic Spain and the rebellious Dutch Protestant provinces ended with the Treaty of Westphalia's recognition of an independent Dutch republic. Germany remained a patchwork of more than 300 states, and Spain remained in control of Flanders, now Belgium, and southern Italy. The Netherlands emerged as a vital new political, economic, and cultural force. The Calvinist Protestants had no objection to lending money at interest, and Amsterdam replaced Florence as Europe's banking center. The Dutch East India Company dominated trade in the Indies and controlled much of the worldwide shipping that was bringing Europe new prosperity. Religious toleration attracted immigrants, including Jews and America's future pilgrims, and they further contributed to Dutch wealth. At a time when most Europeans worked in agriculture, over half of the population of the Dutch Republic lived in towns of more than 30,000 people. This urban middle class had an insatiable appetite for painting. Art historians estimate that between 5 and 10 million Dutch works of art were produced and sold in the 17th century. I'm turning again to Simon Schama's series, Power of Art. This one is on Rembrandt, for an introduction to the culture of Amsterdam and to the work of perhaps the greatest portrait painter of all time, Rembrandt. Fast forward a decade, and Rembrandt produced this masterpiece, one of the most famous paintings in art history. It is no longer on the list, and I don't think any other single omission, except perhaps Picasso's Guernica, has provoked more outrage from our fellow AP Art history teachers. Here's what I think. So I'm not asking Mrs. Whitaker to show this fascinating segment of the video in class, but if you want to thwart the College Board's evil limitations on your education, the video up on Canvas analyzes this painting brilliantly. Here are the times we don't, alas, have time in class. And with that out of my system, I will succumb to the crushing might of the College Board and talk about their only required work by Rembrandt, which is an etching. To be fair, Rembrandt was also one of the great masters of etching in our history. To remind you, etchings are made by covering a plate of metal with wax, incising the drawing into the wax, and then pouring in acid that etches through the metal plate. Soft wax is easier to carve and allows for more diversity of shading and depth, as you see in Rembrandt's etching of Christ receiving the children. The deeper the etching, the darker the image, chiaroscuro coming alive in prints. This is the kind of religious art that pious Calvinists would hang in their homes, though not in their churches. Rembrandt made very serious money from this print. Our required Rembrandt etching dates from relatively early in his career, although also from a time when Rembrandt was enjoying considerable professional success. This marriage portrait marked the first time that Rembrandt presented himself as an artist at work. He is highlighting his skill at drawing, a critical skill for a painter, and also, of course, for a creator of etchings. So this is really a kind of advertisement. I think it's intriguing that Rembrandt has etched himself so much more deeply than his wife. Saskia seems almost to be a pale shadow in comparison. And he's not looking at his wife, he's looking at us. On the other hand, she seems lost in her own thoughts as well. Is she validating his choice of profession by looking on, or is she wishing he'd get a real job? Rembrandt loved to draw and paint himself and his wife in different guises, complete with costumes. Here is Saskia as a shepherdess in a pastoral scene. And here we see Saskia portrayed as a prostitute in a tavern, sitting on the lap of the prodigal son, which is another self-portrait of Rembrandt. You'll notice the resemblance to the etching, which was made a year later. I could imagine this showing up as an attribution. But this Saskia is livelier and less detached, and Rembrandt, well, he looks as if he's had a few too many. The good times, by the way, ended all too soon for the prodigal son and for Rembrandt, who entered into a difficult period in his career. In fact, Rembrandt painted the end of the prodigal son story just a couple of years before his own death. Some art historians consider this his greatest painting. Note that in his later paintings, Rembrandt's brushstrokes become much looser, almost impressionistic. Many critics of the time thought he'd forgotten how to paint. I find his late paintings magnificent. Indeed, Rembrandt was both behind and ahead of his times. The next generation of Dutch patrons wanted more refined paintings. They were moving away from their Calvinist roots. They wanted to be more like those fashionable Baroque, the French, the Italians. Rembrandt moved in the opposite direction. His paintings became darker and rougher. In many ways, he anticipated directions that art would take 2 centuries later. As the Shama video mentioned, the rising Dutch middle class gobbled up portraits, and one of its Dutch masters was Frans Hals. Okay, he didn't make the cut either, but I want you to see what is probably Hals' most famous painting. He's especially admired for his ability to capture human expression and for his cheerful depictions of human nature. Frans Hals also influenced another Dutch artist who didn't make this most recent College Board cut, but I love her work and I wanted you to get a brief taste. The famous Dutch tolerance extended to women artists, and Judith Leister had a very successful career as a portraitist. Note the portrait. In this portrait, she depicts herself painting, and painting skillfully. Do you remember Artemisia Gentileschi? And stay tuned for a similar portrait by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun in our next unit. This painting showed up on past AP tests, but admittedly from the old curriculum. What we have here is a genre scene with a typically Dutch Protestant moral bite. It seems unlikely to me that the proposition that this well-dressed man is offering the much more simply dressed woman involved anything honorable. The subject matter, the moral undertone, the use of light, the interior scene all mark this work as Dutch Baroque. I could imagine you're being asked to identify it as such. You'll also see a resemblance to Vermeer, the painter of our next required work. In the past, the College Board has loved to use a painting by Vermeer for one of its attribution essay questions. So I'd like to open our discussion with a clip from a video, narrated by Meryl Streep, by the way, that shows a succession of famous Vermeer paintings. She closes with this question: what makes a Vermeer a Vermeer? When the first clip is over, I hope you can take a few minutes to come up with your own answer to that question. And then we'll pick up the video again and hear one expert's answer as applied to our required work. I realize it's a little discombobulating to see several short video clips, but the video does a better job of describing Vermeer's use of perspective in this painting than I could, and you're hearing from real experts. The video mentions the conservation restoration of this painting. I thought you'd enjoy seeing a before and after depiction. Something the video didn't mention, but the Khan Academy video did, is that her hand holding the balance is the exact center of the painting. The woman's hands, the jewelry, and the tabletop form the shape of a pyramid. This imaginary pyramid supports the woman's hand and encloses the balance. In other words, the seemingly simple painting is very carefully composed. One of the ways that Vermeer infuses his paintings with light is by using a technique that in the 19th century would be called pointillism, creating color combinations with tiny points of light. These are details from a different painting, by the way. Here you see it. Post-Impressionist Georges Seurat has also dropped off the list, but I'm throwing him in here to illustrate pointillism. You may not have time, but that well-known art historian, Bugs Bunny, gives a great explanation of pointillism. If you don't have time, check it out on Canvas. In recent years, there's been a storm of controversy over how Vermeer created his paintings. The controversy stems from speculation that he produced these exquisitely detailed paintings by a kind of cheating, that is, by using a camera obscura or pinhole camera to trace images. Here's a simple diagram of how the camera obscura works. And here's an illustration of how Vermeer might have used it to create the perspective in one of his most famous paintings, The Music Lesson. Pardon somebody else's French. I think the illustration is pretty clear, even if you can't read the explanation. But what the words in French say is, polished glass is placed on an opening at the back of the darkroom. The painter can draw a sketch on it. And here's the actual painting that you just saw on the slide in black and white. Note, by the way, that Vermeer's paintings very often show a window that's admitting light, but we never see what's outside the window. Also notice, and this is true of the woman with the balance as well, that while the objects in the room cast shadows, the human figures do not, reinforcing the sense that they are absolutely captured at a fleeting moment in time. Just a few more points about our required work. Vermeer made some interesting compositional choices. The bottom left of the painting in the background, for example, is higher than the bottom right to make room for the balance. And here's a comment from the National Gallery in Washington, where this painting now lives. The interplay of verticals and horizontals, of mass against void, and of light against dark creates a carefully balanced but never static composition. This subtly reinforces the theme of spiritual moderation, and that brings us to a final point, which I thought the Khan Academy brought out well. What is this painting about? Art historians argue about this, but I find the interpretation I just read pretty plausible. Pearls are a traditional symbol of earthly vanity. Perhaps the woman is balancing vanity and modesty, love of the world's wealth and love of God. Likewise, the mirror can symbolize vanity, but it can also symbolize self-knowledge. Maybe here it represents both. The painting in the background is, of course, the Last Judgment, and that certainly suggests that this woman should be focusing on her eternal soul and not just on her beautiful pearls. By the way, I find it interesting that Vermeer was a Catholic convert in the very Protestant Netherlands. He married a Catholic, and they actually named their first child Ignatius after the founding of the Jesuit order. This isn't our last required work, but it is an excellent example of another typical Dutch Baroque genre, the still life painting. These were very popular with urban middle-class customers. Still life paintings, of course, gave painters an opportunity to show off their ability to paint reflected light, transparent objects, and rich textiles. And they also gave the owners an opportunity to show off the wealth and widespread trading connections of their urban merchant middle class. Even back then, Ming vases from China were pricey. This is a so-called vanitas still life that combines the customer's taste for luxury goods, the artist's mastery of realism, and again, a moral message. Note the skull, the ticking timepiece, the overturned glass. What do you think that message is? Life is fleeting. You need to make the most of your time. And finally, we come to our last required artist, although not yet her required work. Flower paintings were another very specific, very popular genre that showed off an artist's technical skill. Notice that the brushwork here is tight and precise, really almost invisible, in contrast to Rembrandt's broad, loose strokes and Vermeer's dots of light. Note, too, the careful composition of this work with its strong diagonal. The painting may be still, but it's very dynamic. Flowers were a major product and major export product of the Netherlands, by the way. Okay, I hope you watched the Khan Academy video because this work is not going to get the time it deserves. This is another required work that we could easily have shifted to our next unit. Rachel Ruysch was the daughter of a noted biologist and naturalist, and this painting shows that she shared her father's interest in scientific observation, access to his impressive specimen collection, and probably an interest in the world revealed by the newly invented microscope. Do you recall the symbolic messages of this painting? The wheat and grapes may reflect the bread and wine of communion. And what color harmonies do you see? There's lots of complementary red and green. Here is a close-up. Do you see any similarities to Vermeer? They both use points of paint to capture light. I'm going to close this podcast and this unit with just a few more paintings by Rachel Ruysch so that you're ready for an attribution question, right? Gotta love the grasshopper. Note the date. And now note the date again. Rachel Ruysch had a very successful painting career that lasted over a long period. By 1741, we were well into the Enlightenment and our next unit.